Awesome. Well, look, thank you everyone for coming today. This is our main event, summarizing the work of Q1 this year, which has been around the concept of ecological health, which we'll get into. At the premise of the event is really looking at urbanization and disease development, and that's some of the things that we've been focusing on. There are some new people that have joined us today. So I'm just going to give a quick recap as to who we are and what the Urban Health Council is, what we've got coming up, kind of what we're doing, as well as then getting into the work. And then at the end, we do want this to be a discussion. There is a sort of a form of question to be posed so that we can start asking questions together. So let's move forward if I can. Right. So Urban Health Council set up by us at Centric Lab. As it says, that's what we, on the tin, that's what we do. We are a neuroscience lab. The lab is led by Araceli, who's on the call with a team of scientists from a variety of backgrounds, and we endeavour to use our insights and research into the lived experience of urban dwellers to understand the different challenges and inequalities that people face in urban environments, and as a result of urbanisation and the poor health pathways that are created. We have kind of 4 strands of work. So we, as a lab, do work on commission basis. So we will obviously work with communities in most times and most capabilities in a kind of pro bono form. But we do work to try and create better places. So placemakers and shapers, whether they be organisations, public or private, as well as working at a city level for people like a Greater London Authority or an NGO like Environmental Defence Fund. But we also realizing that we need to build the infrastructure that supports changes around community health is building tools and resources. And that's where really a lot of what today's conversation comes to. So one of those tools is a project called Know Your Health, with the domain there. And this was created as a stepping stone to discuss the ideas around place and health. A survey is underpinned by a playbook that allows people to explore and kind of starts to gamify through an educational process how the world around us is a contributor towards our health and get us to start thinking about these things. We've also created tools such as Right to Know, which is the Great Britain's first geospatial tool that's set to a postcode, allowing people to discover the environmental data and health insights related to that. As a form of an environmental health justice tool. That's going really well, and we hope to be able to grow that in the near future, subject to sort of some very interesting and exciting conversations right now. The data that helps underpin that, and the data that we've been working with a geoscience company, allows us to do a lot of the research that we do on a national scale to start questioning the actual health conditions of a place, not by whether someone can go to an expensive organic food store, or whether they have enough parks to go to, but to understand more about the environment around them, such as their exposure to factors that we understand are detrimental towards health, such as air pollution, light pollution, noise pollution, as well as factors around urban heat island. And there are other things that deprivation has as a form of sort of social and economic determinants of health. And lastly, why we're all kind of here is when we set up the Urban Health Council as a platform to bring people like yourselves together, as we can start to shift the narrative away from health being a factor of personal choice, but one that is a condition of the sort of urban habitats that we live in. We produce a series of reports that you can kind of see there as their kind of table of them, and the reports are there to provide that infrastructure for anyone to access and to use to support their works, whether it be at a practice-based level, whether it be at a policy-based level or campaign. And the point about urban health is that it is investigating why it's unique, and when we do say urban health, it is about that sort of intersectional lived experience of urban dwellers, in particular their experience and exposure to environmental and psychosocial stresses, which is the crux of a lot of what we do. We look at issues that are systemic because arguably that is avoidable. We forget that everything is a choice. I should say the systems we have are all made up everything is a choice. The decisions that we have to allow people to experience things a certain way are all by choice. That is a systemic, it is a question of equity, and is avoidable. We endeavour to focus on biology to ensure that we can be inclusive, so we don't necessarily want to pick on a certain social class, etc. And we can actually create quite a universal approach to biology and remove the conditions that may exacerbate structural inequities. And we do believe in justice. We do believe in bringing equity to people because there are inequities, and so we look to challenge them. And those are kind of three core elements of the work that comes out of the council. Each sort of semester as such, we are going to be delivering a report. And in this case, in this semester, we've actually delivered quite a few, there's quite a few broad topics. But what we're doing is producing written formats, audio formats. We've done, I think, 3 podcasts, including an audio report for this quarter, as well as going into producing more videos, as well as redesigning our workshop formats. Today we're going to be covering ecological health, but over the next 3 quarters, we're covering climate change, the concept of gendered health in cities, and ending the year in a far more sort of future-gazing, inspiring form of what are healing futures, looking at the various epistemologies of health and society, and how can we start to rethink our worlds in the sort of very Anglo-American one that we live in at the moment. So we are going to be changing things up a little bit. This is just a very crude diagram that we put together. And so today's format of event is actually going to be the last of its kind. And we're actually going to be organizing our work a little bit more through sort of 3 main strands of engagement, where we are going to be having 2 campaign-based groups, and we will meet quarterly to share within those groups how the new layers of research produced are supporting campaign-based issues. So we're looking at far more macro-based elements to support campaigners out there. And we're also going to be ensuring that we are also addressing the issues around place. So looking at sort of scenario modeling and workshopping particular situations, and how the research that's been produced can help influence and inform micro decision making. As we have just done with one sort of sponsor of the Health Council, we're also helping to produce urban health toolkits that are there to support practice-based organisations actually bring on the insights from the council into what they do, in the main aim that we do believe, and the point of the Health Council is to allow for community health their practice to centre the reduction of biological inequity, which means that we don't want it to be a top-down. This is meant to be an organisation that is delivered by people for the people around them, and those who attended the event at the beginning of the year and subsequently have joined to produce the work are sort of evidence of that. So just as a reminder, we are a non-profit programme. Some people on the call are very gracious in contributing, and we endeavour to stay as far away from any restrictions to the work that we do, and that's why we're independent and not sort of subjected to any larger institution. So if anyone does have, and I know everyone's pennies and pockets are tight, but if anyone does access the work, please do consider making either just a donation or a monthly contribution. Right, so on to event 1. So I'm going to summarize some of the events right now, so some of the activities, and then we're going to go forward into a discussion. So first of all, we've got 5 pieces of work, and I'm going to go into all of these. This is all on the premise around the concept of ecological health. At the core, its definition is that it is a constant dynamic interaction between a person and their environment. And I think it's important to bring that up because when we solely look at the idea of health and behaviour, we get very prejudicial and predominantly racist advertising, such as this from the NHS, which talks about issues such as heart disease or diabetes or obesity, issues relating to weight, purely as the concept of eating a salad. And it's a very illegitimate way of framing health. A friend of mine was actually the stylist on this advert, and the model in question was also a dancer and I'm trying to remember the other sort of, she was a highly physical person, and just to
jiu-jitsu trainer and a nutritionist.
There we go. Thank you, Erica. And so it is illegitimate to portray health as just a case of personal choices. And that's what this report really goes into understanding, that we have to move away from the sort of Eurocentric views of poor health being a punishment or God from sinning, and the fact that this rarely changed and was often used to justify eugenics, that some people were worse than others. The idea that their health is a result of their choices or their choices of their forebearers, which is incorrect. And unfortunately, we even see it in perhaps, we see it seep into organizations who may not choose to think of themselves as racist, for example. But this advert coming from Al Jazeera is portraying an overweight brown-skinned man in front of a bunch of fast food. But it is an other goods that he is trying to sell. But is it the question that is actually genetics, or is it habitat? And that's the point of looking at ecological health, understanding that when people are paired with these stressors, in the experience of poverty, biological systems become disrupted. So this point of research people can go into through the reports as much as they want. The team have done a fantastic job in bringing out a library of work that supports this. When we look at ecological health, we're not just looking at people, we're also looking at the broader environment, and we have to treat the environment healthily, because in the most simplest of terms, what is a healthy environment outside helps supports what's a healthy environment inside. So Jake Robinson, who's a contributor to Centric Lab and the Health Council, is a specialist on the microbiome, talking about how our gut bacteria can be heavily influenced by the quality of the biodiversity in our local environments. And as he says at the bottom, particularly malleable during prenatal development and early life. So we're starting to really look at the formations of people's lives being almost determined by the quality of the habitat that they are in. The second piece of work was looking at around the history of disease. This was a fantastic audio report with, I think, Hannah, who is on the Zoom event at the moment, as well as Rhiannon, who is a medic, and produced by Araceli and Elahi, going into the full sort of history of disease. So we look at three structures and understanding that many of the issues that we have been as a result of societies forming around the need of mass production. So I won't read out the three details here, but it is around the age of pestilence, first then the Industrial Revolution, but we're now going to era of degenerative health, where our environments are now actually eroding at our systems due to the combinations of everything from microplastics in the air all the way through to the particulates that we are breathing and destroying our local habitats and water, etc. So again, the history of disease, understanding that it is not a case of everyone just being ill and doing bad things. We've also got to understand the habitats in which people are formed, altering their biological baselines. Looking at issues around diabetes. So I'm not going to read everything out here. You can glance over what you want, but the team focused on, in particular, diabetes, and we'll cover in a second, obesity, as two disorders and diseases that are very sort of illegitimately viewed in our society as factors around just eating too many chips or too many chocolate bars, when they are an incredibly complex disorder as a result of a full system alteration in how people are producing things such as glucose, etc. And if people have questions on that, Araceli is on the call for a little bit later. But very simply, this report highlights that in order to address something as diabetes, we have to look at the environment that goes around. Within that, for example, Elahi put together this great diagram, which discusses how these conditions in the local environment and looking at the health pathway that's effectively lead to the prevalence of and development of diabetes. And so when we're looking at the environmental factors, we both look at the broader environment as well as the types of environments, so the type of work or the home conditions and family organizations. It is not just a matter of they ate too many chips. We have to look at how people are living in their habitat and support through issues such as worker rights, through social rights, to create healthier lifestyles. Charlotte, who I don't know is on the call, led a fantastic piece of work looking at the intersection of obesity and trauma. I think there's a lot that can be said about this. I won't go into the details of this, but again, looking at the idea, if we go into the sort of penultimate paragraph, the idea of structural violence being that one that it is, to describe the outputs of racism, classism, sexism, and other marginalizations, and marginalizations that we do see in urban environments, around issues around deprivation, the choosing that certain environments can be more depleted, the choosing that certain environments can be polluted more and more, and the lack of investment in them is a form of structural violence. And this is a trauma. It is not a case of whether there are more parks close to people. And actually, for a separate project, we looked at a correlation as whether children who are being diagnosed as very overweight or obese when they're at 6 years old, and trying to look at the relationship between green space and cases of obesity, and there was no correlation whatsoever. There were equally as high cases in areas such as Barking and Dagenham in London as there are in Southwark. Barking and Dagenham had huge levels of accessible green space, but also higher levels of childhood obesity and being heavily overweight. And so it's incorrect to start saying, well, build more parks next to people and they will go, talking about the actual social capital and the role of society in the prevalence of issues around obesity. And the last was almost a positioning by Marie, part of the team, looking and emphasizing that depression isn't necessarily just a mood disorder, given that the majority of people who are diagnosed will often explain physical symptoms amongst it, and the long-term impacts that physical symptoms can have. And so we shouldn't just look at a person being situationally sad or depressed as just the idea of depression, but a full body shutdown in this way, which then in environments that are highly polluted, etc., causing further inflammation, there is a relationship. So that's something that if people want...
Because mashafu.
Oh, I'm sorry, Zainab, if you could mute for a moment, please, that'd be great. Again, positioning the role of the wider environment as a pathway to the development, or doubling down on something such as clinical depression. So summarizing this and the kind of closing remarks of the work that has been produced, and something that we can get onto our conversation, is that we split this into sort of broader health justice considerations that we need as part of any justice movement to leave room for discussing the set of causes of a disease, as disease is part of a manifestation or extension of injustice. We need to understand the broader determinants and understand the underlying contributing factors, not just the outputs and outcomes that are occurring. Understanding a narrative shift, which is contributed towards that, and understanding the transgenerational effects that directly contribute to disease. Again, is it that a certain group of people are more predisposed to an illness because of their race, because of their color of their skin, or their class, for example? Or is it the chronic disproportionate exposure to the factors that are covered in this, in this talk or in this report, that has actually caused an impact to, for example, their parents, and that has been passed down? from a health justice point, we actually shame people more and more and blame them for being issues such as obese. And this can be a doubling down feedback loop. And again, not enough is done to actually question the environments and the systems that cause this. So we spend more time telling people to go for a run rather than demanding clean air that prevents them from regulating their system. And there's also a sort of language shift. And this is something that Charlotte, and when she was speaking with Sarah LeBrock, who is an obesity campaigner, talking about the idea, and instead of saying you are obese, it's the idea of living with obesity. You know, it's not a lifestyle choice, it's accepting it as a complex issue. And as I said, we shouldn't be saying that X group is more at risk, but understanding the racialization of X group is going to be a consideration towards that. And then when we actually look at sort of urban health practice and policy, you know, sadly, when you do look at the majority of publications, they are still looking at health very much as looking at the symptoms and trying to make adjustments and, quite frankly, ignoring the broader systemic. So there is a public health narrative that needs to be addressed and understood, that the majority of non-communicable diseases are not a result of personal choice, that they are related to our body's physical interaction with its environments. I think one of the key things here, and as we go towards the end, is looking, first of all, we, you know, Centric Lab are one of few people looking at the ecological health situation and the idea of place and health, and obviously as a pathway, unfortunately, to disease. We do believe that health and place can be a good thing, but it's very critical that people are suffering, and so we have to challenge how people are unjustly suffering. I think one of the main recommendations that, as it stands, there is a huge distance between public health bodies, environmental agencies, and the urban planning sector. For example, we're thinking about, the urban planning sector is arguably decided by what's called the National Planning Policy Framework, which is a central government document, large document that sets out how activities in the urban environment, mostly around urbanization, should be developed and considered, that then local authorities kind of decide their own plans on top of. And the question is, well, if we understand and accept, and it has been discussed by many people before, that our environment around us is a contributor towards our health, why is the places around us, why are they decided and defined by someone with an urban planning or policy degree who's working in the urban planning department? Why is that not actually decided and defined by public health bodies? Why is it not a joined up process when those working in public health are dealing with the outcomes of the problems caused by siloed based working? Equally, environmental agencies and their relationship with other public health based bodies. Again, if you look at the UK, and something that Centric Lab are going to be doing is looking at the levels of industrial based pollutants that are coming out into our environments, toxifying our water networks, destroying our trees, and breaking our, in sort of, what's the word, again, polluting our air. These are all contributing factors towards our ill health, yet these two bodies remain separate. So as we kind of ask a question, and I kind of stop the mini TED talk here, and I hope it's covered what we've been working on, how it can be used, where it supports, what are the key messages to get across. I guess a question that we want to go into and ask between ourselves is that, how do we, and it's not to put it all on you, but how do we start looking at these narrative shifts in order to sort of shift the ideas around policy and practice? Like, what can we start basically doing as of tomorrow? How do we get this work? How do we get these viewpoints? Where are you guys seeing the opportunities for change? Are there certain areas of policy or practice that you feel are ripe for being changed? Is there something that you're observing? This is a question that we want to sort of put out. So I'm going to stop there. I don't know, Araceli, is there anything you want to follow on with what I've said, or are you happy for it to go to an open conversation?
Yeah, I just wanted to stop for questions. Does anybody have any questions on the breakdown? Yeah, that Josh just gave. And if not, I was just going to round up a couple of summary points. Okay, I'm going to do a couple of summary points, and as I do them, if anybody has a question, please do either raise your hand or just put it in the chat. So the main takeaway of this is a epistemological change, i.e. that the knowledges that we're using need to be updated, and also those knowledges, how they are applied, make a difference in how we are perceiving disease, which in turn is making a difference on diagnosis, in treatment, and in prevention. So for example, in the case of obesity, the point of that report was to take obesity and look at it from a structural violence perspective, which means environmental injustice, racial injustice. So that takes a very different look. It moves the conversation from what is the individual doing, but more importantly, what is the system doing or not doing to support or impede that human's development? That completely changes the conversation of obesity, all the way from a social vernacular to a policy vernacular, right? So from a social perspective, if we understand that obesity is a very complex disease with weight being only one of its phenotypes, then we begin to understand each other in a very different way, right? In terms of not shaming people, in terms of inclusivity, et cetera. But it also means that from a policy perspective, organizations like the NHS should be pairing up with clean air organizations or the environmental agency to start cleaning up things like air pollution. But it also should be working with social housing to ensure that people's housing is up to scratch and not causing trauma. And those are the types of changes that these reports are there to give, both at a health justice perspective and at a policy perspective. And the other thing that I wanted to highlight from a health justice perspective is also all of us that work in health justice, we should be updating our language. So for example, in those examples of the NHS and the Al Jazeera, we often also, people of color, we can use, I would say, inaccurate language where we say Indigenous people are more likely to suffer from XYZ, from diabetes, obesity, PTSD, which we do. And we can say because of poverty, because of equity, et cetera. But the beginning part of that sentence, Indigenous peoples, is where we gave an example of the update to talk about the racialization of an Indigenous person, the racialization of a Black person, because it's not the color of their skin. And we're propagating that thought by just saying Black or Indigenous or Asian. It has nothing to do with that starter biology in people and everything to do with the system. And then finally, showcasing that it's not just about genetics, right? Genetics is just one component. But again, that conversation that genetics, i.e. our body is having with the environment, is where the problem lies. So much of this quarter was language, being more accurate with our language so we can have a more accurate framing, a more empathic framing of what these disorders are and their roots. So then we can have more accurate narrative towards the solutions and justice.
I might actually, just because of your comment, so I should say thank you, RJ. But I might actually, Carolyn, ask you to speak again, because in the chat box, you've actually discussed how through the experience of working with colleagues and other members of staff, you don't actually use the term obesity in the conversation of active travel. Is there anything that you feel that you can share about that as a way of overcoming some of these stigmatizations that come?
Yeah, I was just sort of like I was saying, that's a sort of policy that came out of a workshop that we had about eating disorders, and the fact that reference to obesity can be a trigger. So that's why we choose to. It's sort of like, I don't know. I'm just trying to figure it out in my head, because that obviously does relate to the sort of blame culture around obesity being to do with individual actions. Whereas if you were to, I was sort of thinking in my head, if you were to, in terms of reframing it as a more systemic thing, and the structural violence and ecological health from that perspective, um, then we're saying that that sort of, there shouldn't be that sort of blame or like idea that it's a notion that it's as a result of individual choices, but at the same time that has come out of somebody's lived experience. So um
I mean,
I don't,
it's
I'm
yeah,
trying to sort of I'm trying to get my head around it.
it's a
um
really good point. I mean, everyone, including the people that are experiencing these diseases, are part of society, right? So, which, if they feel shame, and that's why they said that they don't want that language included, or that possibly physical inactivity is better suited, that's because of the culture of shame that has been put around obesity. I mean, there's a whole set of literature that people that experience obesity don't like to go outside for exercise because of the social insecurity that they are going to be made fun of or harassed, or violence can also incur. And so I can completely understand that perspective. So again, in changing the whole system, and understanding and putting it out in the literature, because the NHS is a very, it's just so insidious with the language in the NHS. It's not accurate. But two, also, obesity is not an eating disorder. Obesity is a metabolical disorder that is also to do with the endocrinological system. Eating disorders are bulimia and anorexia, which are more down the anxiety pathway. So there's also that distinction. And then three, whilst exercise and a good diet can help support, yes, that is true, but we need to continue on with that sentence. So if someone is walking next to a road that's incredibly polluted, that is also going to start changing them at a cellular level, which again can affect them in the presentations of obesity or diabetes. And the changes can happen really, really fast. There's an example that somebody from the Environmental Agency put out of a young kid, very anecdotal because it's only one, but it's still, the phenomena is there, of a child walking to school with the encouragement of active travel. He lived by the North Circular. He developed asthma within a month. There are other factors, of course, that we would have to look at, but we can't make these suggestions without tackling that system. And that's why we keep saying the system, the system, the system. In terms of accessing food, you need to be able to afford it. But B, so much of our food is now full of pesticides, which also cause endocrinological deregulation, which again is another pathway to obesity. So then we have to then start talking about food supplies and food production as part of the conversation with obesity. And that's what we're trying to get at. Add the complexity, add the systemic language to it.
Yeah, it's that. I mean, that's what I'm trying to process, is how it might affect our communications and how we frame things. Because everything we do has to have sort of climate lens, and and framing. But I think there's so much overlap, um, with environmental um, and health justice as well.
Yeah, massively. I
Yeah.
mean, the microbiome is the perfect example, right? Because of pollution and because of climatic changes. So the microbiome in the soil is changing, which means our food is changing, which means our access to it is changing. And there goes the cascade again into diseases like obesity and diabetes. So it does very much have a direct link to the, I would call it more planetary crisis than necessarily the climate crisis.
Can, can I ask a question about how we can avoid a sort of sense of despair? So, if as people, in terms of this reframing, um, from being sort of about individual choices to highlighting the sort of ecological aspects and, you know, the systemic injustices and the impact of that on people's health. How do we, how do we, I mean, obviously, you know, we want to sort of campaign for changes, but how do we avoid people just feeling like it's sort of hopeless, especially people who are particularly suffering, who are at the sharp end of all this?
Well, again, good question. I mean, to be honest, a lot of people who are the sharp end of it are the biggest advocators. They are the ones actually who hold hope the most and drive us forward. You know, Rosa Mondado Kisi, through her grief, has changed the way that we perceive air pollution. Angela Fonzo from Southall, through the despair in real time that she's feeling through air pollution, is leading a massive campaign down in Southall and in the South, and is now doing a ton of speaking engagements across the country to bring attention to the phenomena of gaswork sites and air pollution. The community up in the north called Stop the Stink, again, through severe poor health outcomes, are galvanizing, and they had a little bit of a change in the law that pushed the needle again one step further. So I think it's more to highlight that it's the people that are suffering the most that are doing the most amount of work. And it's just, how do we show them the solidarity? How do we join them in their advocacy, either through providing tools, time, resources, money, to make those efforts move faster for them?
If I can just add on that, I think some of the big issues we've been observing is like the totality of the problem so the totality of the issue is sometimes the problem, that, you know, okay, we want massive decarbonisation, but an individual, it can be very hard to do that. And so we kind of got to break it down. And arguably, I think there's a very political based issue and a policy based opportunity that, you know, 2024, we've got a general election and people are going to be electing everything from local ward councillors to local representatives. And so as much as anything, it's about asking the questions of those people. So in the form of, are you going to be changing your climate impact assessment for anyone who's going to be making a change to our local environment, such as an infrastructure developer or a real estate developer, or someone who's going to be building a new waterway? What new policies are going to be introduced? And these are nudges almost. They don't solve every problem, but collectively they can hold systemic issues to account. The same can be said in urban planning about the impact of, the influence that a health impact assessment has. And at the moment, it is just a box ticking process done by a consultant with, I'd say, not enough training in the realms of health, certainly not in some of the issues that are coming out from the literature, such as the Health Council. And there is a document that can easily be edited, adapted, and improved at a local level by a local authority, and have certain conditions within each local authority depending on the scale of what is taking place. And so there is a nudge at which someone can either campaign locally or from a city point of view. It doesn't have to be always trying to convince the good hearts, trying to get the good intentions of bad people in central government to change, but you can very much influence local councillors from a political lens to address these issues. So I think, yes, from a totality point of view, it is alarming, but there are, and I think something we have failed at more broadly in the UK in particular, is understanding what are the micro elements of policy that can be influenced, rather than we tend to focus on some of the big totality based issues. And so I think those are, for example, two small entities, but it's also asking your local councillor, what are you doing to hold the accountability of an environmental agency who doesn't penalise those who fill our water with raw sewage? And that's where we have to be able to hold people to account. And so some of the work that we endeavoured to do through the Health Council is to provide the literature, the grounded literature, other stuff we do at Centric around the data that supports those conversations to be taking place. So I think that's where it's kind of like, find the one nudge that you can lean on in a local environment and hound that counsellor until they take your call and take your message. And I think that's perhaps a way to start framing these things, is not to look at the totality of needing the NHS and the national planning system to become friends. That should be done. But when it comes to individuals, it's going to your counsellor's office and going, what are you doing about the pollution that's coming from whomever into our environment? Because my kids are going to get sick if you don't change. I think that is something that we've observed can be the most impactful way to kind of support change and give agency, but also hope, because it's something we can attach to, it's something we can believe in, and it's something that we can change. I just think we've been beaten down very much in the UK to believe that we can't change anything, but we can. And there are plenty of campaigners on the call, so I wonder if anyone else has a retort or a comment against what I've just said.
Well, I'm seeing Hannah. Hannah, do you want to say your question?
Yeah, it's just a bit of a rewind to what you were saying about language and reframing. I just want to say everything that you're saying is absolutely brilliant, and I'm like looking forward to hearing about campaigners respond to Josh's question. I just wanted to go back to the language and say a really helpful way that I've found to think about the words that we use, and it's a really like good critical lens when we're thinking about the languages, to think about in linguistics, it's called nominalization. So it's like a really subtle form of legitimation when verbs become nouns. So the use of a verb would be like to displace, for example. And when you're talking about it as a verb, it requires both a subject and an object. But often we talk about displacement as displaced peoples, and this to repeatedly use like displaced or marginalized as nouns, it assumes that it's a pre-existing category of people, rather than to think about that there's a subject and an object, as in like someone is displacing somebody else or someone is marginalizing somebody else. And I think we use it so often in the language, but also when we're reading documents, we see groups of people become nouns rather than thinking about how that the process of that group becoming a group. And another thing is about like abstraction. So thinking about like urbanization and population growth, we use these terms so broadly, but we don't think about the context or causality. So sometimes if we're just like reading a report or we're like hearing people talk about stuff, it's quite helpful to like isolate the words that we're all using and the assumptions around it, and to like add in the context or the causality, or to add in, to change all the nouns back into verbs, which requires us to think about subjects and objects. And that's a really good reframe, I've found.
Yeah, that's such a good point. I think that's what we're doing with racialization and saying the racialization of people, and I think we often use marginalization of people for those reasons, because it is that phenomena, right? The racialization of people, because race in itself doesn't exist. It's an illegitimate concept, because it's not stemmed in biology, and it was set up by white men to contain power. And as you're saying, it makes you think, well, wait, hold up. So it's not just because a person's skin color, or because that, just simply because of who that person is. It's through all of these processings. But definitely going to be checking all of our language to make sure that we're doing that. That's such a good point. And by we, I mean you. It would be great to bring you back in to help us with that, because that's a really good point.
Thank you.
Cool. Does as Josh said, there were other campaigners. Oh, Joanna, do you want to say the written part out loud, please?
Yeah, sure. So I've just put a comment in the chat box about a new requirement across Wales for health impact assessments. Some organisations are doing this. Obviously, lots of people across civil service and the public sector do equality impact assessments, but health impact assessment isn't always done for big projects. So as an example, I work for Natural Resources Wales, and we've started to implement health impact assessment for all kinds of projects like flood infrastructure projects. We're doing one on a land management project to do with wildfire. So it's about really putting into practice some of the current thinking around the climate impacts to health, for example, or air quality impacts to health. But the legislation is being developed this year, so I think it's a really opportune moment to make sure that some of this new thinking and the work that's been done influences policy and practice, and the kind of training and rollout, which will then happen as a consequence right across the public sector, and will of course inform the way that we work with the private sector, for example, through permitted industrial sites, who are kind of our clients. We're the regulator, so we have to permit them. So there's an opportunity, I think, to really change the practice, even in a small way, to incorporate some of this thinking.
Cool. Thanks, Joanna. We always look forward to see how this work looks in practice. Does anybody else want to add? As we said, there are also campaigners. Does this resonate with any of you guys that are doing campaigns, or do you have any questions of not how to use the document, because I guess that's pretty self-explanatory, you cut and paste and and put it into your work, but it's how in that reframing it could help move your work along. So I guess an example would be we're working with Angela to start including some of the more systemic parts. So yes, of course, it affects your respiratory system, but in the long term, 100% South Hall is going to have higher levels of diabetes, obesity, PTSD, anxiety, depression, and everyone's going to be scratching their heads as to why. And yet we already know that the story is starting right now. It's starting with this constant pollution. And so it's just setting that groundwork up, moving that language to capture more people's attention to hopefully enact change.
I'm just wondering, we've got two people from Race and Health on the call. We've got Mita and Sonora. I'm wondering if either of you guys, just because of some of the things that we've been covering, I think are issues that you guys also cover, where there's any comments that you may have. Going to throw you in the deep end. If you would prefer not to say anything, then by all means do say that. But just wondering, because you're covering a number of these issues as well, and whether some of these perspectives are things that are shared and echoed by some of the things that you guys are looking at. Mita's just said she's unable to unmute at the moment.
I'm really sorry, but I'm feeling a bit under the weather today, and I'm just here to listen for the time being. But thanks for the invitation to speak on this.
No worries, no worries. Cool. Well, there is no need to take up time unnecessarily from people, but unless anyone has any further questions, please do go to the work. So yeah, just last call for questions on what has come forward, questions about what is coming up.
Sorry, there's one more question, Juliana.
Well, hi, I'm just wondering, because the conversation is a lot into the communities and the public, the politician, but is there a space for companies and businesses? Because I think that is such an important thing to come across, and they have resources also to help to amplify this type of discussion. But is it? I don't know. I'm just asking.
I would say that there is, and there's in the report for the environmental factors of diabetes, some of the things that are discussed are conditions of work. And so factors around shift working, etc., are a contributor to poorer health outcomes. And so there is good business practice that has a role and a responsibility directly as to how they provide dignity to their employees. I say that is the most immediate. The second is slightly harder, but arguably what we're discussing here is the general abuse of urbanization and industrialization in the name of an economic agenda, which is really profit making. And so what is required of companies is to accept that there are the negative externalities of how everything of what they do has an influence on broader public health outcomes. We're seeing it through the guise of ESG at the moment, that if you have a good environmental, social, and governance structures, you are going to be of a lesser impact than you may have been in the past or than others. And it's a good first start. I know that Sophie Taysom is on the call, who is an expert in ESG and encouraging companies to develop these structures. And arguably that is the first place to start. But the more that companies, for example, I'll give you a very simple one, where a company can actually positively lobby for a change in policy, for example, would be to encourage the protection of storage space. I know that sounds weird, but when you go into a store right now on a high street, retail space is very expensive, but is also maximized towards sales space. Basements, for example, are often turned into another form of transactional space, somewhere someone can either engage and try and sell something. Very rarely is there a lot of storage space. And we can see this in the constant delivery of goods and materials on a daily basis into dense urban environments going through residential and other neighborhoods. And so we ask the question of, well, if goods could be stored at a higher amount, is there the need for so many, for example, heavy goods vehicles to be traveling through environments? Arguably, you can make the case for no. However, at the moment, because rents are so expensive, the need to maximize transactional space is very high. So why, for example, is there not a change to go, we're actually going to increase our levels of storage space so that we're systemically reducing the levels of deliveries that we need for certain goods that we have an increased capacity? And so there's a lot of sort of thinking around that businesses can do. And they can, because they have huge power and weight, try and influence to ask local authorities or someone like a Greater London Authority, can we please have an incentive to encourage more storage space because I can't economically justify it at the moment? And I know that's not necessarily the nicest way to always have to think about things, but that's also sometimes the most practical. So there's a direct way of dignity for employees and understanding them as people, their places, their habitats and places in which they live. I've often said to people who run workplaces that great work, an interior office design is a waste of money when if you're trying to get productivity and health and well-being, you probably give £500 to every employee to put blackout curtains and change the levels of noise coming into their home through better insulation. That'll probably have a much bigger impact on their ability to be productive and well at work. And so, that's where to start treating employees and understanding them and their lives, not just these nodes of employment. That's the direct way. And then the indirect way is understanding how are they contributing to these broader impacts in our environment, and systemically start to go, how do we chip away at these issues?
Josh, could I just jump in for a sec on the ESG point? Okay, so I work with companies in real estate to consider their position with regards to environmental, social, and governance considerations. What brought me to this initially, because I had the public policy health background, having worked in the Department of Health for quite a number of years, is this kind of fundamental mismatch between how we think about health and how we think about the built environment. So, for instance, we know that if you do minor improvements in homes to support aging in place, you can have multiplier effects in terms of improving health outcomes, reducing falls, all of this sort of thing. So I think things like ESG have a huge potential because it is about, for business, what are the financial levers and also what are the financial costs and benefits. Having said that, there are also a lot of companies who want to leave a kind of positive, lasting legacy. So I'll leave it there.
Cool, thanks, Sophie. So Saba, are you free? Are you able to unmute?
Yeah,
And then
I am.
from Saba, we'll go to Guppy, if that's okay, Guppy. So yeah, you were saying that in the US, sorry, I mean, you can read out your own statement. I don't know why I was trying to meddle.
Sure. I was just thinking that the public's understanding of some of the systemic effects that you talked about is not widespread, and basically amplifying these types of discussions and having accessible reports is important. But I was just thinking about what more can be done.
I mean, I'm from the US as well. There's a lot of public knowledge on this. I mean, it was the public who started these conversations to begin with. I mean, Professor Bullard has done academic work on it, and he is now well known for saying that someone's postcode has more to do with their health outcomes than their genetic code. But also if I can Google it quickly, I'll find it. But if not, if you Google the history of environmental justice in the US, there is an array of, there's one specific timeline that puts the chronology of the different communities that have been talking about this. The problem is the other way around. It's the top down that don't want to recognize it. And then the most famous example is, or one of the most famous examples, because there's tons, is the cancer corridor that runs through Baton Rouge and up the Mississippi, that's been going on for 15 years, as well as the Lakota and Dakota peoples talking about the way that water systems affect all aspects of health. So there's a lot of work. I think you have to go towards the Black knowledges and the Indigenous knowledges to get it. And I would definitely recommend the work of, I always forget his full name because I always refer to him as Professor Bullard. But Josh,
Robert.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, but I guess what I was specifically speaking about was more some of these like epidemiologic issues that you guys talked about regarding like the microbiome and more kind of the linkages between numerous diseases and the built environment, and more specific built environment factors that have impact on health. Just things like that, more so than environmental justice in general. But yeah, definitely there's been.
Are you talking about like having the language for it?
Yeah, I'm having the language for it, and also like familiarity. Like I don't know if the general public has, there's a lot of familiarity with these kind of linkages between social determinants and environmental determinants of health and diseases.
Right. I mean, again, when you look at the community level, especially the communities that are facing environmental injustice, they do. They may not express it within a scientific lexicon because they don't have to, but certainly the knowledge is there. And I also hear it all the time here in the UK. It's being able to, I think it's more having the role as centric to, as Dan always says, looking at the mechanics of it. But certainly the expression is there from people understanding that their cancer, their obesity, their breathing problems are all related. I think maybe when you don't necessarily live in those environments, which is another set of population, then yeah, there probably is a little bit of a knowledge gap. But in our experience, when you speak directly to the community, they understand very well those links. Guppy, do you want to say something?
Yeah, I'm just conscious of the time, but it really just riffs a little bit off what you just shared in terms of I guess like thinking about impact and supporting like positive health outcomes within communities that are affected by environmental injustice, like as you say, like a lot of communities are already there with their understanding of what the problem is and the more like holistic analysis around ecological health, and there's a role to play. Like I'm speaking from the perspective of someone who is, you know, middle class, resource, salaried, and like works in relationship and alongside communities that are impacted or on frontline, that the relationship dynamic is like so important to consider, and we talked a little bit about that in terms of like lexicon or narrative and framing of that dynamic and of the problem, but also that the practice of community organizing or organizing within community is itself has an outcome, like has a positive health outcome, like the relationship building, the trust, the development of connection, can also be seen as really important, even if as a campaigner, you know, what you're looking for is to like stop a pollutant or a hazardous environment from existing. You could also, a byproduct of the work or the practice is also something that we should pay attention to, and that a lot of the outcomes should also be focused on that community being able to heal from the harms that are a result of the environment around them, but also that there's a lot of healing for organisers who work alongside communities to do as well, in self-learning around power, in self-reflecting awareness, and the fact that like in the end we are all impacted by the environment that we exist in, and just keeping conscious of like what you bring, what you learn and take, and how you build that kind of dynamic relationship in a way that's really conscious of power, and the process of building a campaign alongside and with communities is really like nourishing in itself, and can be really nourishing, as well as it sometimes feeling a little bit scary. So just kind of encouraging that thought process as people venture into solidarity work, I guess.
Yeah, wow, no, it's a really, really good point. The idea of social cohesion, and yeah, I mean, there's in the work of under PTSD, social cohesion in your social bonding is a very key determinant as to whether or not you are going to develop PTSD or the severity of PTSD when you're going through a trauma. That those who belong to more social cohesive communities or part of a strong community have that, and the idea of communal healing, something that we hope we hit in the last quarter of Healing Futures, is that communal healing, and as you said, the word solidarity is such a good word. Okie doke. So we are at time. Does anybody want to say any other quick comments or thoughts? Oh, sorry, somebody's put Tamala, because honestly, my American accent. Do you want to say something about the importance of language?
Just quickly, and you had it right the first time. I'm American also, and it's Tamala.
Tamala, okay,
Yeah.
okay, cool. Sorry.
It's just I have just actually been looking at documents, planning documents, and I'm really interested in place and concepts of place. And it really feels like there's so much placemaking going on and so much emphasis on place and people in place and health in place, which you were talking about also. And I feel like it gets reduced down, like I said, to the physical context, but actually a place doesn't happen until people are in it. And making sure that that connection is strongly focused on, I think can help ask for more from built environments and from planning policy and things like this. So that, anyway, that's something I've just started looking at, but I'm really interested. I think what you've talked about today is fantastic, and I'll be in touch, definitely. Keep paying attention.
Dope, thanks so much for that. It reminds me of, we were speaking to one of our, Angela, who is actually it's a Guppy Connect, because pretty much everyone that's awesome Guppy knows. But we interviewed her. She is of Quechua Indigenous descent, but living in London. And she said, when I asked her, I was like, what, how would you define nature? And she said two things, which go to your point. The first one is nature is also people, and we are also each other's natural resources. So when we are asking for, you know, the conservation of natural resources, we also have to ask for the conservation of human resource, because we are each other's resource. And then the other thing that she said about, it was specifically about Elephant and Castle. I don't know if you're if y'all are familiar with the words market. And she said that they used to call it the life-saving market because of all the different social interactions that the market allowed that actually saved lives. So she said, even though you see a building that is dead, the activity of the humans in it were able to save a lot of lives. Absolutely. And then the destruction of that structure meant the destruction of that community, which then she said, now that's one less resource that I have that my son has to learn about his Indigenous culture in London, which again, I was like, wow, that is seriously deep in that relationship. As you said, that place isn't just the place, the physicality, but it's also the people.
Yeah, exactly. And the stories within it, and the stories that place can support. But so often, especially in the last few years, placemaking is all about retail opportunities and development. And I just find it really frightening, quite tragic. And I think it feeds into the mental health, absolutely, but also physical health, like you've been discussing. So it's really, really great work, really interesting what you're doing here.
We've in the past talked about, instead of using the word regeneration, use the word rehabilitation. There you just have so many different pathways to support existing energies and peoples, and regeneration is one that's just used through a very economic lens, not its actual original sort of more ecological and environmental lens. So there again is another opportunity for different wording to be in play.
It's so interesting, isn't it? And it's also like a co-opting of language that becomes this kind of consumptive, consumerist focus. It's quite scary.
But I thought I'm very happy to talk to you more about stuff like that, because it's exactly what I do for Centric. So if you're looking at issues around that and implementing it, please do drop us an email.
Great, I will. Thank you.
And I just put a link to Hannah's what is it, Space and Place, right? Is that the right link, Hannah? Yeah, right. It's a book or study.
Yes, sorry, it was written in the 70s, but it's been really central to the understanding of humanistic geography, and it really goes into how do places become places, the process from space to place, basically. It's great.
From space to place. Got it. Okay, thank you so much for that. And the link is there, and I guess we can always what is wrong with me? I can't speak today. We can always add the link to the summary. So Josh, do you want to wrap up?
Simply say thank you very much. Keep an eye out for some updates in how we're going to be running future events. The main way that we want to run them is they become more useful to people who join the Health Council. So please do spread the word of the reports that we've been putting out. They're there for everyone who is working at the intersection of justice, cities and health. So please do share them out. If you know people who would also like to support the Health Council, then please do that. We are a non-profit organisation, and all contributions go towards the hiring of scientists from marginalised backgrounds to support the work of the general lived experience in urban environments. So on that note, keep an eye out for updates. Make sure you're signed up to the newsletter, and thank you for coming along today and for sharing insights and thoughts. And please do continue to try and make healthier, better places for people. Cool. And on that word, bye-bye and have a wonderful day.